Chapter 7. I waited until I was sure my parents were sleeping to slip out the back door. It made less noise than the front. I clutched the casserole dish against my side and slipped down the steps. I'd filled it with everything we'd had left from supper. There wasn't much bread, but there was enough spaghetti for 3. Chapter 7. I waited until I was sure my parents were sleeping to slip out the back door. It made less noise than the front. I clutched the casserole dish against my side and slipped down the steps. I'd filled it with everything we'd had left from supper. There wasn't much bread, but there was enough spaghetti for 3 people. The Tyner's house was all but dark, the only light coming from the side of the house where Rusty had pointed his room to be on several occasions when we'd played ball. I slipped across the road between the bushes that lined their house. There was no curtain, and I could see Rusty, his back to an unmade twin bed, watching television. I tapped on the glass, and water sloshed out of the cup in his hand. "What are you doing here?" he mouthed, wearing nothing but tattered blue pajama shorts as he struggled to lift the old window. Seeing Rusty shirtless was nothing new. We all went swimming together often. He hadn't changed much over the years, still showcasing his scrawny bird chest. Chapter 7. I waited until I was sure my parents were sleeping to slip out the back door. It made less noise than the front. I clutched the casserole dish against my side and slipped down the steps. I'd filled it with everything we'd had left from supper. There wasn't much bread, but there was enough spaghetti for 3 people. The Tyner's house was all but dark, the only light coming from the side of the house where Rusty had pointed his room to be on several occasions when we'd played ball. I slipped across the road between the bushes that lined their house. There was no curtain, and I could see Rusty, his back to an unmade twin bed, watching television. I tapped on the glass, and water sloshed out of the cup in his hand. "What are you doing here?" he mouthed, wearing nothing but tattered blue pajama shorts as he struggled to lift the old window. Seeing Rusty shirtless was nothing new. We all went swimming together often. He hadn't changed much over the years, still showcasing his scrawny bird chest. I pulled the blue lid back from the food and held it up to the light. He turned back to the room just as Thomas stepped around the corner. I'd never seen Thomas in shorts, and his legs were strikingly white compared to his arms. His chest wasn't much darker, but it was broader than Rusty's, and had muscles I'd only seen on boys in magazines. I quickly averted my eyes back to his face before he could catch my analysis. He held the same look of confusion as Rusty. He came over and helped Rusty push the old window frame up. "I brought you something to eat," I whispered, sitting the dish on the windowsill. Thomas looked past me over my head toward my house. "You shouldn't have done that, Bree." "I wanted to," I insisted, hoping he wasn't offended. It only just occurred to me that they might not want my help. "Besides, it would have gotten thrown out at my house," I added quickly, so they'd see it was no big deal. "Hand it over," Rusty said eagerly, reaching around Thomas. "You'll have to warm it up," I said, but Rusty was already tearing off a piece of garlic bread and popping it into his mouth. "Thank you," Thomas said, uncertain, looking over his shoulder with the shake of his head as Rusty demolished the breadstick before turning back to me. "Do you want to come in?" "No," I said, taking a step back. I'd always wanted to see the inside of the Tyner's house. It looked so small on the outside, but the thought of going in now made my palms sweaty. "I better get back. My parents don't know I left." I waved a quick goodbye. "I'll get the dish back tomorrow," I said, chewing on my lip as I stepped out of the bushes. Before I made it to the road, I heard a loud thump and turned to see Thomas standing below the open window. He was wearing his jeans from earlier and pulling a white t-shirt into place. "At least let me walk you back," he said, jogging to catch up, his hand lightly brushing mine as he came to a stop. "Really, you don't have to do that," I said, suddenly hit with a case of the nerves at being this close to him, alone, in the dark. "It's just across the street." "But it's dark," he countered. "Aren't girls afraid of the dark?" "You would know," I said snidely, cutting my eyes at him. "How's that?" he smirked, with the tilt of his head. "Being a vampire, I'd imagine you'd know better than anyone about who's afraid to come out at night." "A vampire? With those white legs?" I chuckled. "You're either a vampire or a ghost. So which is it, Casper?" He grinned and playfully elbowed my side. "Cut me some slack. I didn't wear a lot of shorts in the city." I glanced up at my parents' dark window as we crossed the empty street. The glass reflected the streetlight, causing my heart to skip a beat. "I'll get us a good stockpile of food at the store tomorrow," he said as we reached the side of my house. I'd hate for someone to snatch you up in your attempt to keep me fed." "How do you know I'm not trying to keep Rusty fed?" I challenged, just as the cricket started up again. "So you've brought food over before?" he asked with the arch of his brow. "I didn't realize. Rusty looked pretty surprised to see you." He looked so sure of himself. I hoped Rusty ate all the spaghetti before he got back. "I didn't know Rusty needed food before," I pointed out, smiling a little when his face fell. "I've got to get inside, or did you intend to walk me to my room, too?" He crooked a grin and took a step away from the house. "I'd wager you've got one of those high-pitched girly screams," he said, crossing his arms. "I suspect I'll hear you if there's trouble." "Stop being a jerk," I said, giving him a playful shove. He surprised me, catching my hand and pulling me a step closer. His hand felt warm against my skin, and every nerve in my body stood on edge at the closeness. I couldn't take my eyes off his lips as the thoughts of what Katie had been up to with Rusty flashed in my mind. I'd never kissed a boy, ever. He leaned slightly closer and whispered, "Do you want to ride to the store with me tomorrow?" All I could manage was a nod as I watched him disappear into the darkness. Thomas borrowed Mr. Johnson's car. I was surprised Daddy was letting me go, but I think Mama standing behind me might have had something to do with it. It could have been that, or the fact that Rusty and John Tyler were going too. Either way, I was basking in the newfound freedom. I'd never been anywhere without an adult. Thomas was standing outside the car getting last-minute instructions from Mr. Johnson. He glanced at me when I walked up, and I wondered if Katie saw from the steps. I'd been dying to tell her about last night, but she'd still been in a sour mood about Rusty when I'd called this morning, so I didn't bring it up. Not that there was all that much I could share. I slid in the back seat with John Tyler. He was clean for once, his hair still damp from a bath. He wouldn't let anyone but me help with his seat belt and was disappointed about having to sit in the back with a girl. He'd whined about wanting to sit up front with the men until I'd threatened to leave him behind. By the smug look Thomas gave me in the mirror, he was enjoying our conversation. When we got to the store, Thomas bought everyone a Pepsi Cola and a glass bottle. They were my favorite. Daddy brought me one back any time he went into town, but John Tyler acted like it was Christmas morning as he sipped his. Thomas did most of the shopping, but he encouraged Rusty to pick things out too. They mostly bought snack cakes and chips. Thomas did get the biggest canister of beef jerky I'd ever seen. I took John Tyler out to the sidewalk while they paid, so he would stop asking for everything. "Drink your Pepsi," I encouraged, grasping his hand to keep him from going into the road. He threatened to walk home if I didn't let him go. Rusty was all smiles as they loaded the bags into the back of the truck, but that changed when he reached for the passenger door. "Why don't you let Bree ride up front this time?" Thomas suggested. My stomach instantly filled with butterflies as his eyes met mine over the hood. Rusty rolled his eyes and shot me a hateful glance. "What happened to us sticking together?" he rambled, pushing the seat up hard and grudgingly climbing into the back, stuffing me in the back seat with a little pipsqueak over some bony-armed girl. Thomas ignored him and slid in next to me. "Gotcha something," he said, handing over a pink flashlight about the size of my pinky. "So you won't be scared the next time." "Ha ha," I said, fingering the key ring it hung from and feigning indifference, even though I was jumping up and down inside at the thought of him thinking enough about me to buy it. "You think you're so clever." He laughed and turned the radio back on. The wind was warm, blowing through the window, ruffling my hair. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the passing cars. This was almost as good as driving myself. I'd had my permit 2 whole weeks, and besides driving home from the DMV, I hadn't gotten to drive at all. Thomas looked like he'd been driving for some time, holding the steering wheel with one hand, his other arm propped on the window. I was relieved to see Katie and not her daddy sitting on the steps when we pulled in. She didn't miss that I got out of the front, looking at me like I was the second coming. "Don't go running off with that skinny-armed girl," Thomas kidded Rusty, gesturing to Katie as he pushed the seat back on him when he tried to climb out. "Help me carry this stuff across the street." "Tell your daddy thanks for me," Thomas said, tossing Katie the keys as she emerged from the porch. "I left a couple dollars on the dash to cover the gas." Yeah, Katie brushed him off, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the steps. I looked back at Thomas like I should say something and found him looking at me the same way. "Come on," Katie said, giving me a jerk. She didn't say anything as we stepped over toys on the way up the stairs. Their house was always a little cluttered. Katie kicked a towel out of the way and pushed her door open. Her mom cleaned in stages. Unfortunately, rooms were destroyed pretty soon after she finished them. Mrs. Johnson was never with a vacuum in her hand. "You!" Katie said, shoving me back on the bed. "When did that happen?" she asked, pointing toward the window. I had to bite my tongue to keep from smiling. "Me?" I said, astounded. "What about you in the field the other night with Crusty Rusty?" "Shut your face," she said, clamping her hand over my mouth. "And don't call him that. Rusty's not so bad." She smiled sheepishly, twisting her hands together. "Apparently not," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "Did he give you your tongue back?" I asked, shaking off the disgusting image that question conjured. "Breland," she said, her cheeks burning bright, "did you have to see everything?" "According to Rusty, we missed the main performance," I said, elbowing her in the ribs. "You do know that is gross on so many levels." "If his was as big as his mouth," she trailed off. "How do you know how big his stuff is if you haven't—" She looked up and rolled her eyes from the pile of dirty clothes she'd assembled by the door. "It's a figure of speech, Breland. It hurts to know you think so highly of me." "It hurts to remember you rolling around in the field with Rusty, too," I said, dramatically, sticking my finger down my throat. "How can I eat corn this winter without thinking about that? You tainted our corn." Mrs. Johnson pushed the door open just in time for Katie to hand her the pile of clothes, which made me wonder how long she'd been standing in the hall. Katie must have had the same idea. She leaned her head out the door to be sure her mama was gone before closing the door. "Rusty's just for practice," Katie insisted, sitting closer to my side and patting my leg. "You know, for the high school boys next year." "Speaking of high school boys, it looks like you are just skipping right to the major leagues," she gushed, plopping down next to me and patting my leg. "Don't even try to argue. Rusty told me you went to their house last night, late." "Shh!" I urged her. "If anyone hears you, I will never see the light of day again." "So you did go over there?" Her eyes were the size of golf balls. "Yes," I said quietly, "but just to give them—" There was no way to explain it to her without giving up their secret. "You got me," I sighed. "I went to see Thomas, but I didn't go inside." She looked disappointed. "But he walked you home," she clarified. "Geez, for a practice boyfriend, you and Rusty sure do gossip a lot." Katie and I had been whispering about boys since she'd snuck into the boys' bathroom at school on a dare in the 6th grade. Most of the boys we'd talked about until now were filtered in through a television antenna or glossed over in magazines. Having them flesh and breathing right across the street was like a giant leap for womankind, or at least for us. I peeked out the corner of the window to see if Thomas and Rusty had come back. Katie bounded around me, pulling the curtains wide and taking up the whole view. "Are they back?" "You tell me," I sighed. "So much for being subtle." She grinned wide. "Of course they are, girlie." She went over to her dresser and pulled a box out of her underwear drawer, retrieving a glittered tube of lip gloss. "You want some? It's strawberry flavored." She waved it in front of my face. "Rusty loves it." "Ugh, Katie, please spare me the details." "Come on," she grinned, grabbing my hand. "Let's go kiss some boys." Mrs. Johnson spotted the lipstick from the other side of the house, but Katie pretended not to hear her, dashing out the screen. She was already talking to Rusty by the time I made it down the steps. Thomas was with Mr. Johnson, the hood of the Chevy propped open, so I walked behind Katie and Rusty down to the river that ran the length of the back side of our properties. Katie and I squealed when Rusty threatened to throw us in. He was the only one dumb enough to jump in. That water was cold no matter what time of year it was. I picked through a patch of clovers for one with 4 leaves while Rusty teased Katie about her braces. When their bickering turned to something more intimate, I headed for the fields. The hood was closed on the old car and Mr. Johnson was gone. Thomas stood, wiping his hands on a white handkerchief before sticking it in his back pocket. I pretended not to notice him, turning toward my house and listening to the chickens clucking away. Mama must have been feeding them. "Go for a walk with me?" Thomas asked, tugging my ponytail as he came up from behind. I startled, not expecting him to be so close. "Through the corn?" He nodded, starting for the field. "It'll keep the crows away. Your daddy should appreciate that." He had a point, I thought, as we walked side by side into the maze. "Rusty off with Katie again?" he asked, running his hand over the top of the stalks the way Daddy always did. "Yeah, I left them down by the river bank," I said, stretching on my tiptoes, my fingers barely grazing the tops. "I hope they stay there." He chuckled at my disgruntled tone. So we should steer clear of the river? Please, I stressed. My eyes can't take any more. Not a big Rusty fan? He mused, sticking his hands in his front pockets of his jeans. Don't get me wrong. I have no problem with him. It's just the two of them together. I shook the thought away. Katie's never had a boyfriend before. I think that's part of it, too. It's just new. You don't take too good to new? I glanced up and found his deep green eyes. Lost for a moment, the answer slipped out like melted butter before I could stop it. New can be good. Ordinarily, my answer would have been a resounding no. Changing from elementary school to middle school had been a horrible experience. Then there was the whole monthly visitor who had shown up in the 7th grade.